different philosophical arguments for the existence of God, looking at these different evidences and so forth to prove that God exists. And we've looked at quite a few. Some get a little bit deeper than others. Some are probably a little bit harder to understand if you've never looked at them before. But you know, these are arguments that you can use, and if you find one or see one that really does make sense to you, that certainly our intention is not to just try to outthink or out-scholar someone who doesn't believe in God, but to plant the seed and get them to understand and have that urgency to want to know Him and start thinking in the direction of, because once we can get someone on board with believing that there is God, there's a supreme being, then we can start to direct that and try to funnel it into the Bible and getting them to look towards the Bible. But they're not just going to accept the Bible if they don't believe in God. And so it's really hard to reason it with them. A lot of people just try to go straight to the Bible against an atheist and say, well, look at what the Bible says here and historically and all these different things. And it's not going to do a whole lot. But if you can reason with them, and especially on their level of what they understand, or bring a lot of arguments in areas of which they are familiar, then we can make some traction. And so that's what we've been doing these last couple of weeks. I want to continue it again tonight and into next week probably, and then we'll start getting into the scientific part, move out of the philosophical and into the scientific. But I love the philosophical because it really is hitting an area that a lot of atheists are trying to hit right now. We left off with looking at the conscience, these moral arguments that we can make. And this is, as I mentioned last week, if I was to sit down with an atheist, if I was to sit, my brother is a self-proclaimed atheist now, and if I was to ever be able to get that conversation with him, and hopefully at some point I would be able to get that, or anyone, this is probably the moral arguments, and then we're going to be looking at some beyond this tonight. These are the arguments that I would probably use more than anything else, because they make the most sense to me. And I think they would make a lot of sense to people who really are, bring an open mind and some honesty to the discussion. Of course, nothing's going to work if you don't keep an open mind, and if you're not sincere, if you're not honest about it. Left off, as we look at the conscience part of this, I want to revisit these drives that we have. Because we have certain drives. These are things that are inside of us that go beyond just simply the physical. And of course, if we were all just come from one single cell, and it was the same cell, there should be absolutely no variation. There should be no difference between any of us. We should all think the same thing because we just are all one, just mindless particle, a bunch of particles or a bunch of different cells in our bodies now. But we have certain drives. We look at these hunger drives and these thirst drives, but we also have sex drives, and we have, what I mean by that is that we have these different, there are different things that attract us. Why do we like the things that we do? When you look at, when you date, or when you get married, there are, when you're first attracted to someone, well, what attracts us to someone else? That's not just a physical, random, mindless, two-dimensional set of cells that have absolutely no substance to them. Something in our mind, why, we look at someone and say, that person is attractive, isn't it? Or we say, that person's nice. I want to get to know that individual. And as we get to know them, why is it? Why, we have, so many different variations of people nowadays. We have dark hair, light hair, red hair, then we have light skin, dark skin, medium skin, all these different skin tones. Well, what attracts us to that particular individual? There's something that does that. Why do I have a craving for certain food while someone else doesn't? How many in here love meat, steak, shrimp, whatever? Well, chicken, seafood. See, that's it. Seafood, I eat it, right? Anything, probably not all food though, right? How many in here love vegetables? broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, beans. We have our cravings, don't we? What's favorite to me might not be a favorite to you, or you just might not flat out like it. Where do these cravings come from? Where do these different hunger drives come from? Just wanting or craving a certain type of food. Where does, and then we crave different liquids, don't we? Water or coffee or punch or, sadly, some people crave much more than that. But where does that come from? There's something that is inside of us that we mentally and, physically, we crave that, don't we? And just, have you ever craved something so much that you just think, I want this, and I don't care what else I eat or what else I drink, I can, it's not gonna satisfy me. I need that, right? And I will not be satisfied until I eat that. That's where all these different things come from. And so we've got these drives. The strongest drive that man has is self-preservation, as we looked at last week. Self-preservation is, it means, in other words, if your life is in danger, if it's threatened, we're not going to be asking for anything irrelevant to that. I'm not going to be asking for a hamburger or a chicken sandwich if someone's life is in danger and my adrenaline's going and I'm going to look at them, right? I'm going to say, hey, I'm just a second, I'm going to go to Arby's or something. I'm going to help that person. There's a drive of self-preservation like that. How many, remember 9/11? When we saw 9/11, most people in here are probably old enough to remember what you were doing on that day, and we see all the news coverage afterwards. What were people doing? After the shock of everything happening, and the buildings came down, and the rubble was all around, and when first responders finally were able to get into where they needed to be, what did everyone around the city start doing? That was it, wasn't it? People were posting pictures of their loved ones, and people around that city who had no idea who they were running into the rubble, risking their own lives for no other reason than to try to find those who were surviving. You think all of them were Bible-believing Christians that were running in there? No. There were atheists that were running in there, people that were just, from completely different religious backgrounds, but they all had one thing in common, and that was to save those who they thought might be alive in there. Why did they do that? Why would they do that if they have no conscience? We started this last week. Because an atheist has to reject that he has a conscience. But an atheist doesn't have a conscience. Unless he gives his conscience up completely and not care about anyone, including his own family, he's got a conscience. But why? Where does that conscience come from? Where does that drive for him saying, I will protect my family at any cost? Someone comes into my house, I'm going to shoot him, or I'm going to defend my family until I no longer see them as a threat. With 9/11, they went running into there, not knowing anyone, and tried to save them. Why would they do that if they had no conscience? They certainly didn't need to. They could have run. They could have just let anyone else. But you think of why people do the things that they do. That's not attributed to the physical. See, but an atheist believes, well, it's all we are a bunch of physical parts that just randomly move, and there's no rhyme or reason for us until something happens. The most renowned atheists, many of them have families. They have a wife, they have children, and you ask them, why, do you love your wife? Yeah, well, why? You ever think about that? Well, what is love? What is these emotions that come up? Something is causing this inside of them. And it's not anything that is on the physical part of us. These emotions drive us to do certain things. And so there's that drive. You go against the strongest drive that man has risk your life to save another fellow human being. And it doesn't just happen in the United States. It happens all over the place, doesn't it? In every civilization the world has known, they've had this conscience. Even where the Bible hasn't been. Because you look all the way back before we've had the Bible or what we have in our hands, and you can read of how people still tried to help others and how they still tried to rescue them. And so, this goes back years and years. But they have, some couldn't care less about religion. Well, they say they couldn't care less about someone else, but then, they will do whatever they can, whatever it takes to save someone. But people violate the strongest drive they have, this self-preservation, to put their own life in jeopardy, their own life at risk for death, to preserve the life of a complete stranger. It's selfless. They're not thinking about themselves when they do this. They know that they know the risk. And so we've got these different drives that really showcase an existence that something had to place that in us. We have this for a reason. It comes from somewhere. And once we can acknowledge that, then we can start saying, okay, well, where does it come from? It's not just some single cell that became another cell, and then here we are, just these physical, things moving around. It's inside of us. It's part of that metaphysical part. Remember the upstairs realm? That metaphysical part, that part that was beyond, that's beyond the conscious, that's beyond physical. The conscious realm, the realm that we can reason and talk to each other and communicate and know that everything around me, and know when someone's in danger, I need to help them. And the fear and all these different kinds of emotion with it. So we have this, this consciousness and these different drives that we see. And then we have a sense of ought, which is another part of this moral argument. A sense of ought means that man has the innate desire to do better. You think about that. We, everything that we have, we have these ideas, don't we? But to us, we're always trying to do better. We're always trying to reach, right? Anyone in here have an interest? Jim, you fish. We fish together a lot. You ever wake up and say, what? I wish I was a worse fisherman than I was yesterday. Sometimes feel like it, I guess, when you get skunked. But do you ever wake up and say, what? I wish I knew less about fishing today than I did yesterday. We don't do that, do we? We want to become better. We want to become smarter. We want to understand things more. And we want to become morally better. But that's who we are, isn't it? That's what the sense of ought is. We continually strive to do better. Everyone in this world strives to do better. You look at medical technology. They constantly are trying to improve, aren't they? They're trying to, every single year. And it's amazing how far we've come with medical technology. And they're still trying better. That's, it comes around to that. Everything is trying to get better. Everything points towards perfection and will never gain that perfection. Not humanly. But it proves one perfection. And that's God. Because if I can realize that we are, and you think about this on the moral level, on the ethical level, if we're trying to get better and better and better and we're not reaching it, something has to be there to be perfect, because that's what's driving us. That's the sense of ought. Humans are always trying to get to that, to that perfected state. And the only perfected state that it can be is the one that is perfect, that will never ever get better, and that's God. It's this thing called God. God is the epitome of perfection. How do we get that sense of ought? Animals don't have it. We have purpose. You think about this. How could the ape evolve? The ape doesn't have a sense of ought. Man has it. Ape doesn't wait. Ape's not thinking to himself, well, I wonder how I could get better today. What could I do to get better? Apes are apes. You look at the oldest apes that we have, and what do? They climb trees, they eat bananas. They'll never do more than that because they never purposed to do more than that. They never wanted to do. They never strived to be better. Now they will, if there's a forest fire, they're going to run and try to save themselves. That's not getting better. That's just trying to instinctively save yourself, or they'll sometimes save their cubs or their babies or their whatever the babies are called in the primate world. Ought is purposeful activity. That's what it is. We have a purpose. We have a drive to achieve. Where does that come from? Purposeful activity only comes about with purpose. And it doesn't happen accidentally. It's accomplishment. That's what we can consistently do, is try to accomplish. How does an atheist explain something like this? If we're just a bunch of cells that don't mean anything and have no purpose at all, then explain a sense of ought, of how we're trying to get better and better and better, and we have the mind to do it, don't we? We always have, and it's always going to, 20, 50, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, if we're still here, it's going to be better than it was, wasn't it? You look at, all the old ancient ways of them doing things. By the way, they were not archaic in any way. They were not unsophisticated. Look at the pyramids and how perfect those were put together. So I'm still baffled. And scientists and archaeologists are still baffled of how those pyramids were put together. You look at how the palaces of ancient times were put together, how everything was and they cut stone. And they didn't have all the power equipment that we had. They did it with everything that they had, but they were sophisticated with what with how they did it, weren't they? That was ingenuity back then. They didn't have all the monitors and technology. They had this, that they could show someone and say, hey, if we do this and cut this here and make this dimension here, and they give a three-dimensional view of what this could potentially look like, and then change it on a whim. And if we add this and we take away this, they just in their minds they knew and talked to each other and had so many people involved with it, and said, this is what we have to cut. Think of Noah building that ark. God gave him, how did he know? How to build the perfect vessel for a global flood. The dimensions came from somewhere. He had to realize, hey, I've got to, if I build this, if he did it any other way, what do you think those waves would have done? It would have tore that thing apart. Especially with with what they had to work with back then. But we get better, and we just, we want the sense of accomplishment. Ape didn't just wake up one day and say, well, today I'm going to develop a sense of ought. I'm just going to do things better and bigger. Didn't do that, did he? But guess what man does? We're constantly trying to achieve that, aren't we? We're trying to reach it. Why? Where does that come from? Something gave that to us. Something put that into us. That makes us different than anyone else at all. And then we have worship. And I wanted to, this is a different kind of argument with when we look at these. This is not a moral argument. We're going to move into arguments from desire. We have worship. These next couple of arguments are ones that are really, I think, they start to hit us personally. Because we worship here, don't we? We're worshipful creatures. Man has an innate desire to worship. Man needs to worship something. Man may determine that he will not worship God. He may not want to call it God, but he wants to worship something. You look at the oldest religions, the oldest beliefs, and even the beliefs today, that have come down through the years, and there's new religions coming up all the time, but he worshiped something. The trees, right? There were people that worshiped the trees. Ancient Egyptians worshiped the trees. They believed there was a God connected to the trees, and the trees were God. They worship a house. They worship parents. There are children that just, they think their parents are it, don't they? They look at their parents, and there is no one that can be better than a parent. And people grow up, and they still sometimes have that, that inside of them to say, okay, I want to worship parents. I want to worship man. Someone comes along, they look smart, they're scholarly, and someone looks at them and say, I'm going to worship that individual. Cults do this all the time. These cult leaders know how to manipulate people. People fall for it, but they're always, and why do they fall for it? Because they want to worship someone or something. They think, okay, someone's higher than I am. Does that make sense? Someone's higher than I am. I have to worship someone greater than me. There has to be something greater than me. And throughout the history of civilizations, every person has worshiped something or someone. Something is going to have top priority in his life. You look all the way back at the Indians. What do they worship? They call it God? No, but he was like God. What do they call him? Creator. Great Spirit. They're different names, different terms, but ultimately they are worshiping someone, isn't it? It's impossible to come up with something like that if he didn't exist. It's illogical to come up with someone greater than me, myself, if he didn't really exist. For me to understand, hey, I'm not it. I'm not the greatest individual because I know that I have flaws in me, and other people realize they have flaws in them, and it doesn't matter how much we achieve, we understand that I am not the top of everything, even on this earth. I could have the most money, and there's still someone that's going to be a little bit better, a little bit smarter. There's someone that's going to, because I'm still going to ultimately die. My body's still going to ultimately break down. The Indians worshiped something. The Aztecs worshiped something or someone. The Phoenicians worshiped someone. The Egyptians worshiped. The Sumerians worshipped. All of these different cultures, these different dynasties worshiped someone. Because to them they understood, hey, there's someone greater than I am. It's illogical to think that way if you didn't know and realize that there is a supreme being that's greater than any man that's on this earth. Man in his innate position to worship shows that there is something worthy to be worshipped. That's what, when we start looking at worshiping. It's against man's nature to worship himself. He might think of himself pretty good, and think, okay, well, and the New Age movement tries to say, well, we're our own gods, or we're our own. But when at the end of the day, they know they're not as good as you can get. Atheists claim that the earliest worship of man was animism. Not so. They say, oh no, it's just, we see animals or whatever, and they just, start coming up with, no, it's God. But what happens? Man starts to depart from God, isn't it? We look all the way back to the garden when the creation first happened. God creates man and woman. Man and woman, they have their children. Man and woman get expelled from the garden. Still understanding, even when they're expelled from the garden, did Adam and Eve still know, hey, God is at the top of everything? They knew, didn't they? Adam knew when he fell asleep, he woke up, woman was next to him, and God said, I made woman. He took a rib out of you, and I made woman. And then they, as they go on through the years, they understood that, God, but then all of a sudden what happens? People start to deviate from that, don't they? And they became so wicked that we're able to read in history that God sends this global flood to destroy everyone. Now everyone's gone except for 8 people. 8 people on the whole planet. And those 8 people all worshiped God, didn't they? They wouldn't have been on that ark if they didn't. They come off of that ark, and you think, how in the world could anything go wrong now? 8 people who all now know the power that God has, the power he can display. We know, everything Noah said. Yeah, that's true. How long did it take after that, do you think, for man to go sideways? We scratch our heads with that one, don't we? How in the world did man become so stinking dumb that they just would go against God, who is capable of creating this massive flood to that could destroy all over the earth? And then the waters recede. Man can depart from God. He can refuse to bow down to God. But he can never disprove him. God is it. That's the very fact that people have that innate desire to worship shows that there is someone or something worthy to be worshipped. You can't get higher than that if it wasn't true. And then when you look at animism, it's this all-powerful being inhabited everything, which is what animism, rock is God, God is rock, God was in rock, a tree was God. That's what animism was. And that's what atheism believed it became. But it was, so that involved, that evolved kind of into polytheism. What's polytheism?
Worshipping many gods.
Worshipping many gods. Okay, we know a lot of cultures that believed in many gods, don't we? Egyptians, the pagans, these pagan nations that the Israelites were warned, don't you dare mingle with them, don't you marry them, don't you have anything to do with them. God knew what he was talking about. He said, you start mingling with them and you're going to go against what I told you specifically. And yet they did it. So we've got these cultures with, but then these polytheism, these many gods. By the way, that word polytheism, poly means many, comes from the word pandemonium, which is actually pan-demons. And it evolved into monotheism. What's monotheism? One God. Which is interesting because there's actually one of the Egyptian pharaohs, and I believe it may have been the grandfather or the great-grandfather of King Tut, who was actually monotheistic. Well, all the Egyptians started, believing in all these different gods: God of the Nile, the god of the air. That they had gods for everything, and we see that in the 10 plagues as well. It was either his grandfather or his great-grandfather who actually was monotheistic and said, "Nope, there's one God," which really kind of went against all the Egyptian beliefs. But polytheism, or monotheism rather, was something that stuck. The belief or an understanding that there's one God. But you have all the Israelites who were in bondage under the Egyptians long time ago, and they said, "No, we know there's one God. It's the God of Abraham. We know that was there's always been one God." So they went back to when God first introduced himself to man, when he created him. When he said, God said, "Don't, there are things I want you to do, things I want you not to do." So this monotheism, this one God, people say, well, supposedly there's no evidence for the Jews' God, this God of the Bible. But you think of the earliest form of religion. The earliest religion was true religion in the Garden of Eden. And it was revealed by God. What did God tell them to do? You can have anything in this garden, but not that tree, right? Why? They had the tree of life in there. They could have lived forever in there. But then someone who challenged God, by the way, Satan's not an atheist. He knew who God was. And he comes along and he tempts them and says, oh no, you can know all about, you can know as much as God does. Well, who wouldn't be attracted to that? And then we know the rest of it. But man has to worship something or someone. There's a priority in his life, someone that he puts way up here. And if he has any wisdom, it's going to be greater than he is. Worship indicates that whoever you're worshiping is worthy of that worshiping. That's where, we get to. I'm going to hold off on the Ecclesiastes next week. Ecclesiastes, when we start looking at the arguments from desire, which is what these are all called, worship, which means, these are the arguments of things that we want, things that we, that we need, that we have this innate need and craving for. And, and worship is, first and foremost with what this this desire is. Having that desire means that there's got to be something there. We don't just want something that can never happen. That's going to kind of roll into the ecclesiastical arguments that we're going to be looking at next week. One of the greatest, it may surprise you, one of the greatest apologists of all time is Solomon. When Solomon wrote how many in here have read Ecclesiastes? How many in here have heard lessons on Ecclesiastes? Not a whole lot of lessons anymore that we probably hear on Ecclesiastes. But when you look through, you start to read his Ecclesiastes. In fact, maybe I ought to challenge you guys to read that by next week. So, a little bit of where we're kind of going to be going with this when we look at it. There comes a point when every one of us asks, is there more? There has to be something more than this, right? We think, is this all there is? Atheists even ask that question. They look out into the universe. They just think, okay, well, the universe goes on and on and on and on. And even Stephen Hawking did that. Carl Sagan did that. Is there more than just what's right here? They were short-sighted because they weren't thinking metaphysically. They were just thinking physically. But when you start looking at what Solomon writes and the Ecclesiastes that he writes, he started asking, isn't there something more than what we have or who we are?
Ecclesiastes tells you that there's more.
Absolutely it does.
You hear Ecclesiastes a lot at funerals.
At funerals? Yeah, I'd say so.
It talks about, there's a time for living, time for dying.
And you hear, it's very timely when you do that. When you hear, you probably hear more for Christian or at least religious themed, rather. But it's true. We see that there's always, when you look at through time and you look at different things happening through it. Solomon talks a great deal about this, but he was one of the greatest reasoners for apologetics. When he wrote this, of course, he was inspired by God as well when he writes the Ecclesiastes, but this is one of the greatest books that I think you'll ever read in the Bible about the proof of God. Genesis, we know that, says God, in the beginning God. Well, Moses, how did he know how to write all that? And Moses certainly believed in God. Solomon reasoned it.